Was there specifically anything you wanted to talk about?
I'm still thinking of a topic. Oh wait,
That's
I think
fine.
I got one.
Yep.
I
Yeah,
think
what?
I got one. I've debated
Minim
this a lot, so
minimum wage?
yeah.
What is your take on minimum wage?
I'm opposed to the whole system.
You're opposed to the minimum wage in general?
Yeah, I believe in market determined wages.
Hmm. Why do you think that wages would be higher if there was no minimum wage?
I think I don't think government should enforce any wage, and I don't like business regulations. I mean, there's some we need to have, but I tend to
Mm-hmm.
like extremely low regulations. But with the minimum wage, it won't be lower, and the only possible thing, it will get higher. I don't think it'll go either way. It definitely depends on the situation, but I think it could be good. I think minimum wage is a problematic system.
Okay. Well, my general view is that I am not really subscribed to like many different principles. Of course, everyone has principles, but obviously what I care about the most is like outcomes and what it has the best outcome for like your average person. Um, and I think having a minimum wage is preferable to not having a minimum wage, considering that I think if there was no minimum wage and there was no baseline for your average person for your average person when they go to a job, I do think wages would be a lot lower as businesses would be able to get away with typically a lot more. Now, when it comes to the minimum wage, for everything I've seen, there doesn't seem to be um, many studies or like research done on the topic that indicates that there's like a significant decrease in like employment or anything. That is a take that is given sometimes that if you increase the minimum wage, then employers will fire people or they'll up prices because now they have to spend more on their employees. Now, theoretically, this makes sense, but it's not really how it actually plays out, at least when it comes to small, gradual increases in the minimum wage. The reason why is because, yes, even though employers are paying employees more, they still won't end up raising prices because even though they're spending more employees, now since there are more people that have a pay raise, people have more money to spend on those businesses. They have more disposable income, so it usually ends up evening out. Like most studies, like on the restaurant industry, I think it was, if I can find it, found that actually prices actually slightly went down. Now, obviously, if you had a big jump in the minimum wage, for like right now it's in America, it's like 7.25. If you increased it like to 15, like right away, like tomorrow it's 15, of course there's gonna be big downsides considering that it would be literally right away. There would not be a transition period. But if it was done gradually over time, like the next 4 years or whatsoever or whatever, I do think that it would have mostly positive effects. I don't. It doesn't seem that it would really dramatically, significantly decrease employment or anything, or really hurt employers all that much. Considering it seems that more people having money to spend on stuff seems to balance out the pros and cons for even small businesses, and obviously a significant increase in the minimum wage would help your average person getting more money.
Yeah,
Though,
but if
yeah,
they have more money to spend, then businesses will raise their prices because businesses want to get more money.
not necessarily. If people have, well, yeah, but then again, when you're living in a free market system, obviously businesses will compete by lowering their prices, assuming there's not like a monopoly or like there's a huge market share being made up by like only a few companies. But assuming there's actual competition, they'll always want to lower their prices. A business that ups their prices because of people having a more disposable income is just going to lose customers that will go to other businesses that have decided, hey, we can capitalize off that. So it wouldn't be something that any relevant business would actually do. And it doesn't seem they would raise their prices just from spending more money on employees, since those employees are now have more money to spend on products that they and services that they produce.
Well, competition would be there. Monopolies are only created by the government again, so competition is very likely in a pure capitalistic society because monopolies are just created by the government and destroys competition.
Why do you think monopolies can be created by the government? Why do you think monopolies
Okay,
are only created by the government?
I'm not. I think I said that too broadly. I'm going to say there has to be government assistance when you're creating monopoly. It's really not plausible to have a monopoly without any government assistance at all.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I read a study. If you want me to send it to you, I send this study to
Okay.
many people. Okay, I'll send it right now. Okay. Okay. Do you believe Investopedia is a trustful source of news?
Just give me a second. Investopedia, from what I've seen from Investopedia, they seem to be relatively decent when it comes to like, giving like more basic information and stuff like that. I think yeah, I think Investopedia
Okay.
is
Okay.
fine. Um, how and why companies become monopolies. Macroeconomics. Investopedia defines a monopoly as a situation in which a single company or group owns all or nearly all the market or a given type of product or service. Okay, give me a second. Most of them rely on some form of government assistance from the government. Perhaps the easiest way to become a monopoly is by the government granting a company exclusive rights to provide goods or services. That is true. That is true. When monopolies are created, while governments usually try to prevent monopolies in certain situations, they encourage or even create monopolies themselves. In many cases, the government created monopolies are intended to result in an economy of scale, so benefit consumers by keeping costs down. Um, um, okay. I mean, I don't think it's true. It's not true that monopolies are only created by the government. A government can create a monopoly for things like that.
Yeah, but to become a monopoly, you need assistance from the government. You can't. It's very unlikely to naturally become a monopoly.
Well, if it's very unlikely, it doesn't mean you necessarily. If it's very unlikely, it doesn't mean that you don't need it. It's just in most cases you probably would. I think a better discussion to have here is not really monopolies and probably oligopolies, in which like a bunch of different firms own a huge part of the market share, or multiple do. Like for example, when it comes to like insulin, I think it's about like 3 companies own about like 90% of the market share or whatever, and they all agreed to spike their prices because competition would actually be worse for them in that circumstance. If there are many areas in the country where those 3 providers are the only providers available and they all spike their prices, well, it's not going to really matter who makes the most money in the end because everyone's going to be making because all 3 companies are going to be making a shit ton of money, and people aren't going to like just not get it because it's insulin they need it to survive if they have diabetes. That's very prevalent in like the healthcare market is like oligopolies. Those can totally happen without government assistance. Considering if larger firms team up to do that, I think if you have how do you even get to oligopolies? We got to we were talking about minimum wage. We were talking about just government assistance
Competition,
in
and you
general, right?
mentioned monopolies.
Yeah. All
You
right. But no, I don't think uh monopolies in the sense that there's only one like firm that offers a product or service is just rare in general, and like how you actually like identify a monopoly. It's actually rare for just a monopoly, like a full-on monopoly. That's why like oligopolies are probably a bigger threat than monopolies. Are a lot easier to happen. And oligopolies don't have to happen from government assistance. It can still happen just like monopolies, but it's a lot. It's definitely not as likely. A lot of that can happen naturally through the free market, and I think government assistance is the only way to really curb that. Now it determines what. Now it matters what type of assistance that you are doing, but when it comes to, like many different regulations, when it comes to, like like labor rights or whatever. I think those are definitely needed. When it comes to, like, the minimum wage, I don't think it would lead to I definitely wouldn't lead to prices going up, and it doesn't seem to be that way. I think it was John, what was it? The Institute. Yeah, there you go.
It's
Minimum wage.
it's like a stimulus check. Economists, liberal economists, um, Barack Obama's lead economic advisor and Secretary of Treasury under the Bill Clinton administration said, if we hand out these Biden stimulus checks, it will lead to inflation because you have more money to spend, and businesses will raise their prices, especially now because businesses are struggling and need money.
Wait, no, that's different. That's different from. We can talk about that within its own, but there's a difference between, like, stimulus checks and just giving out money from the government that is printed
Yes,
versus businesses
well,
paying more to their workers and that's circulating throughout the economy.
but that's exactly what minimum wage is supposed to do. They give you more money. The businesses is required to give you more money so
Hmm.
you can spend more. But when you can spend more, businesses want more money from you, so they'll raise their prices. It's not at this in right now businesses are struggling. It's not about competition at this moment.
Well, I
It's
already told you
about
that it's
actually letting them survive.
we're told it seems that when it comes to, like, the economic research end of it, it would actually end up helping businesses. It seems that the overall revenue of businesses goes up if the minimum wage is increased, because even though they're spending more on their employees, people typically will now spend more on actual products and services from those businesses. It usually cancels out or has a net benefit. Um, and it doesn't seem to really affect prices unless, like, you
But
drastically increase it over a short period of time. I think where we currently stand right now, minimum wage wise, in the U.S. is kind of disastrous. 7.25 is absolutely unacceptable. Um, there was a portion throughout I think it was the 1950s, the 1970s or 80s or whatever, or 1950s, 1970s, where the worker productivity to minimum wage, um, in real terms, not like, with inflation accounted for, was rather one to one, with only small differences. Now inequality has increased over the past few decades. It started in 1980. That line started the gap started to widen, and now we're at a time where the minimum wage is 7.25. If we had kept up with worker productivity from 1980, the minimum wage today would be $22. That just shows how far behind we are when it comes to the minimum wage in general, and when it comes to wages. Wages have kind of stagnated. And I think that if you increase the minimum wage to, say, $15 an hour, for example, which actually still would be lower than the amount that workers are, than the share that the workers got in, like, 1980, when it comes to how much they work at a minimum level, it would probably actually just be good for workers. It would help businesses, and it would just help the economy. The Economic Policy Institute actually had uh, something on this. I can send it to you. I typically like covering, like, the economic sending, like, source from the Economic Policy Institute, because there's many aspects of them that are actually rather conservative. But even then, they made an article saying gradually raising the minimum wage to 15 would be good for workers, good for businesses, and good for the economy. Um, and they kind of go over a bunch of research that's done on the topic. Give me a second. Um, Yeah, but I think overall the minimum wage would probably be beneficial, considering I don't there's not much evidence that it would actually decrease employment or increase prices. In some circumstances, it's actually the opposite. Um, like a study done on the restaurant industry found that prices actually decreased, and when it came to employment, it was the elasticity of employment was relatively low when it came to, like, of how much the unemployment rate increased versus the amount more paid to your average worker. It was, like, very, very low, and it can be canceled out by many different things.
Yeah. But here's the thing. Right now, in this particular time, no matter if you are Democrat, Republican, you can agree we're economically not doing well. Can you agree with that?
Yeah, in some aspects, yeah.
So I don't, and businesses are obviously not doing well. So I don't see how raising the minimum wage is going to help businesses. And I understand that maybe it's been proven, but right now in an economic disaster, it's not time to say maybe it will work. Well, maybe we have to. That's I think the problem here is the we're economically struggling right now. If we were economically doing well, it'd be a different story. But we're not.
Ah, there it is.
That
Upjohn Institute. That's what it was called. Um, yeah, I'll address that. They found that prices rose by about only 0.3% for every 10% increase in the minimum wage, and that was the highest example they found out of like a 40-year period. And that's only about half the size reported in previous studies. But they reserved that in general, small minimum wage increases over time to get to $15 per hour didn't higher prices and may actually reduce prices. When it comes to like if you want to deal with the pandemic or like a recession or whatever, I think actually raising the minimum wage would be a good way of doing this. Um, I mean, if it doesn't really seem to hurt employment, and if it doesn't uh, actually raise prices, if that's what the research indicates, as long as it's done over a gradual period of time and doesn't go like too high, um, then I don't see a problem with making sure that people have a greater standard of living. It's kind of a way of like wealth redistribution. Your average CEO compared to like what they made in 1980 when it comes to like proportion to your average worker, they make so much money. Um, and where does that money come from? It comes from the labor of the worker. The person doing the money that's being generated is being generated by workers and their labor, and most of it, like a big cut of it, goes to the CEO and corporate boards. If some of that could just be taken back and give it back into the hands of workers through a higher minimum wage, then I'm before that. It all seems that productivity goes up because overall happiness goes up if people are in better living conditions. Like the Seattle studies, I will admit, like are a bit like mixed. Like now, most studies are very, I think, seem to be positive. Now, the Seattle studies are very mixed. There was earlier ones that had more negative results, but new ones that corrected for other things had more positive results. But even then, the way that Seattle did some things was a little weird, but overall probably had a net positive. But even like the more negative studies, um, found that uh, it seemed that productivity went up, that workers actually got more work done and productivity went up, even though workers were working less hours in general because they were making more money.
yeah. Well, I again, well, I think I've gotten even so off topic. I said I don't even want a minimum wage. So,
True, I
yeah,
guess you
but I
could say
don't think
that.
it really would. I don't think it really. I think wages, in a sense, would go up with market determined wages. It definitely won't go down. But I couldn't see it going down, but I could see it going up.
Don't you
That's the
think that
thing.
don't you think that like corporations would try to cut wages if they weren't like
They
legally
would.
binded to by the government?
They wouldn't do that.
Why do you think they wouldn't do that?
Why? Here's
Yeah.
why. Because competition. Suddenly, the workers are not going to stand if they start paying the workers $4. They know they can't do this. They'll find another job. That's how competition is supposed to work, and it does work that way. That's the idea.
Yeah,
That's why
I
market
would.
would work.
Okay, yeah, what I would say is that I don't think at least for most workers, probably a vast majority probably wouldn't have their wages impacted all that much if minimum wage laws were repealed because businesses overall wouldn't want to ruin their reputation that way. But I mean, there probably would be some businesses in some sectors that would decrease wages, but I think overall probably not so. But there would probably be some things that would be bad for your average worker, like for example, like the wages not actually increasing over time, or like um, going for like keeping up with inflation. So one thing the minimum wage does, if you keep the minimum wage up with inflation or increase it over like here and there, um, people will be paid around the same they were or a little bit more compared to how much inflation is going up, or how much productivity workers is going up and how much they're actually working. If businesses didn't have that guideline by governments to like pin them down, be like, hey, you have to pay them at least this amount. This is the bare minimum. I don't really see an incentive for them to increase their wages over time to keep up with inflation. Um, but I just don't see like really a big incentive there, because they would just be it from their point of view, it would be maybe more profitable for the business, but it'd be less profitable for the people owning the business. That's why uh that's why they're so staunchly against minimum wage increases. Because even though the business actually could probably bring in more revenue, because more revenue is being circulated through the more money is being circulated through the economy, and more people have more disposable income to spend. They really don't want to do that because the people at the top of those businesses would have a lower cut of the amount of money made. More would be going to the actual workers. I don't really see a incentive for businesses to higher their wages over time, to keep up with inflation, so their workers are making effectively the same amount they would be before inflation, like a minimum wage would.
I just don't. Here's the thing about it. I just don't see it being such a problem here. It just doesn't seem. It doesn't seem. I just don't get why we should have the minimum wage. I'm just well, I think for me, I would definitely consider myself a laissez-faire capitalist.
All right.
So with me it'd be pretty different. Um that's why I'm against it because I'm against most regulations. But again, we can't have a society without any regulations. It's just I don't see that working out. That's why I think I land where I more land when it comes to minimum wage.
Okay. What specifically do you think would be better from repealing a minimum wage, though? Like, how do you think that would be better for like the worker?
I'm not saying it would be better. It wouldn't be worse. It won't be better and it won't be worse. I don't get the problem.
Well, it would be
That's the
worse
thing.
considering. Yeah, but yeah, go ahead.
It it, it won't be worse for them at all. Cause again, it should be left up to these politicians that don't know what the fuck they're talking about. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't. They're not economists. So I don't get why it's left up to these idiots to decide. Businesses should decide. The end of my argument.
Well, most economists support a minimum wage, though. Most economists support
But
a minimum
you're
wage,
not
and most economists
understanding.
support
Does
increasing it.
what I'm talking about is when it comes to politicians choosing. That's a dumb idea. Politicians choosing the minimum wage, they don't know what they're talking about. They're not economists, okay? They should not be determining our minimum wage, and we shouldn't have a minimum wage because of that.
Yeah, I don't trust politicians either, but I'd actually trust politicians more than corporations. Considering at least with politicians, they're supposedly in theory elected by the people they're supposed to represent. So they would probably want the people that they represent to at least make it by. Well, a corporation is only focused on profit for the top of that corporation, not really how their workers are doing. So I wouldn't be comfortable leaving that up to corporations to decide what the base should be, for how much they can pay workers. I mean, there are many different things that the government has done um, to increase to uh, to increase wages. So one was minimum wage. Another one was repealing child labor because that actually increased wages to repeal child labor. Because corporations could spend less on children. Obviously, a bit unethical. Um, But yeah, I don't really see how I would trust corporations handling that responsibility more than politicians. But even then again, if all those politicians are um, being pressured by like unions or whatever, we build up unions or things like that. Well, then we could actually have at least some representation for the average worker, even if it was indirect by pressuring those politicians.
Yeah, I but again, as I said again, I am a laissez-faire capitalist. I'm going to say that again. And I just feel capitalism has been proven to be better than any other system, and that it's great. And another problem I think even most people agree, no matter if you're Democrat or Republican, agree a federal minimum wage is problematic. Local is different. I live in New York City. New York City is better with a $15 minimum wage. Alabama, $15 is very different. It's all about currency in different states. Federal's a dumb idea.
I don't agree with that. Um, Considering that I think the idea of states' rights has been abused throughout history to just like almost objectively have worse outcomes for the average person in that state. Usually done by corrupt politicians within that state. I think a federal minimum wage to have a baseline among states is a good idea. So certain states don't have just like god awful wages. Or like a corrupt government that is not looking out for its workers in some aspect. At least we could have that baseline. Of course, the minimum wage in like New York should be higher than Alabama. But when someone says like $15 minimum wage, they don't mean that every state should have a $15 minimum wage. They just mean that should be the federal minimum wage. You can't go below that. There would be some states that would have higher than that, of course. Um, so, I mean, I already talked about how if the minimum wage kept up with worker productivity since the 1980s, the federal minimum wage today would be about $22. And I mean, some estimates put it at 20, some put it at 24. Now, if we can do, I think Alabama can do 15, and New York could probably do 20 or more. Um, I mean, to be honest, do you? How do I phrase this? Um, when I'm assuming, okay, I'm assuming you care a lot about the idea of freedom, right?
Oh yeah, definitely, definitely. I don't know
Yeah,
what I'm talking about. Yeah,
yeah. Like the idea of liberty and freedom. We can share that. We can share that belief. Obviously, I also very much do. Now, do
yeah,
you? I'm assuming you believe that less regulation more means more freedom, to at least a certain extent.
yeah, yeah.
Um, would you say that like obviously in some ways would you say that not having regulation in some areas could actually lead to less freedom in some ways that regulation could lead to more freedom as in like if we just allowed corporations to like pollute the water all as they
I'm
just like pollute the
I'm
water as
actually
they can.
big. I'm actually big environmentalist. I definitely consider myself. So I'm definitely like I'm for like the Clean Air Act and I think yeah, that's where I become more for regulations is when it becomes
Mhm.
environmental. That's where I tend to lean for regulations. But again, I'm more for cutting them.
Yeah. um so obviously like there are certain like laws and restrictions that we have in society, of course, that even those restrictions, if we didn't have those restrictions, you actually could make an argument that we'd have less freedom. For example, I know it's like kind of silly, but like murder being illegal. If murder was legal, well then for your average person, if murder rates skyrocketed from it being legal, well you could argue that there's less freedom now because even though you have the freedom to murder people, people are literally losing their lives, which is kind of like one of the best ways to restrict freedom if they literally don't have a life. I think we can argue that like your average person might actually have less freedom if they're scared to go outside their house if crime was up from like murder being legal or whatever. Like a hypothetical example like that, where you could actually argue, well, yeah, having a regulation making this illegal could actually increase freedom and allow people to do what they want without like the stress, anxiety, fear, or having those negative outcomes. You can make, and you can obviously make arguments on that like smaller scale, not something as crazy as like murder or whatever. What I would argue is that certain government regulations like a minimum wage, allowing people to have more disposable income actually increases freedom, even though it puts a restriction on the business owners to pay their employers more. Your average person who is getting paid more now doesn't have to be like being like a wage slave working like all day every day trying to pay their rent and trying to just get by, spending a ludicrous amount of healthcare, things like that, and stressing over that. They could actually have the ability to do what they want, have that free time, which I would consider that to be um, them having more freedom, and that would be the result of government regulation. Now, when it comes like socially, I probably agree on this. When it comes like socialist and stuff like that, I think the government probably should just like stay out. Um, but economically, I think there are certain restrictions that a government can put on a business that increases the freedom of the average worker, which is the vast majority of people. Now, now that is just my appeal to like freedom and like liberty and whatever. Though when it comes to freedom, I don't really have some like really abstract love for just the idea of freedom itself, like innately. I care more about like the outcomes, because obviously not in every single circumstance is being more free better, or else we just wouldn't have laws. But so obviously like just freedom itself isn't just inherently good by itself, but I think it tends to be good. But I think you can make an argument that government regulation in many ways could increase freedom for your average person.
I'm more focused on the this idea of business freedom. I'm less focused on the workers and more focused on the business. I I know that sounds I know a lot of people disagree with me, but that's the way I think. I think businesses help our economy, and that's really my whole thing.
Mm. I'm generally think I want to get what I think is the best results for society and the most people, um, that I think we can possibly achieve. Um, I think it's obviously better to make sure that more people are helped in um, better ways, and that is the best way that we can run our society. But when it comes to like businesses, I'm not really a big fan of letting businesses do everything they want or not giving this regulation if it hurts the average person and if it hurts their employees.
Yeah, yeah, I know I'm not debating that vigorously now.
I fucking ran downstairs. I'm out of breath.
I've just been I think, but I do definitely consider myself conservative
Hmm.
Republican. Um, though again, I'm by the way, I'm Eisenhower 1953 in the
Yeah, okay, yeah, I
Twitch.
know. I saw that in chat.
Yeah, and I just get really angry sometimes. Like I say I'm anti government enforcement of different government enforcing this and that, but when it comes to like like coronavirus, that's where exceptions come into place for me. And that's where I'm like, you know what, there has to be some sort of making sure that people take this vaccine, and it's just very upsetting what's going on in the Republican Party for me. And it's like I'm not even in the part. I don't want to be in the
Hmm.
party, though I agree with literally most of their policies. It's hard. And with the Liz Cheney, I like Liz Cheney. I'm like a Liz Cheney conservative, but she has to be replaced by a more moderate and and a conspiracy theorist, and
Hmm.
it just is very upsetting to see a party turn into a QAnon conspiracy theory party that won't listen to science and won't listen to what the people want and just gerrymander and do corrupt shit, and it's sad.
I mean, I guess we have our disagreements, but we can agree that I am also scared the route the Republican Party is going. I'm not
Yep.
happy with the route the Republican Party is going. We might have some different beliefs on exactly why, but I would agree on this the conspiratorial thing. All right. We're gonna have to. I don't think. Is there anything else you want to talk about? Or is that about it? Hello.
That's about it. That's about it.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for coming to the call. I
Okay,
appreciate it. Yeah. Thanks for
bye.
following. I appreciate it. All right. Bye.